Well, greetings, friends, and welcome to Live at 345, which is an extension of the podcast, The Church Dismantled, the Kingdom Restored. My guest today is Eldon Fry, who I'm just delighted to have with us. He is a longtime spiritual director, works with an organization called Open Hands, just came out with a new book that he's going to talk about. And Eldon and I are going to chat about some of the challenges facing pastors and congregations. Even thinking about it in terms of what were those challenges before COVID, in the midst of COVID, and as we come out of COVID, what's the landscape like for ministry? And so we're going to have kind of a spiritual direction here format that Eldon and I will share, and I'm just delighted to have him here with us. He has meant so much to me as my own spiritual director. You can pick up this as a podcast on A Church Dismantled, Kingdom Restored on that podcast. It's also on my YouTube channel that you can subscribe to and find it there as well. So Eldon, thank you so much for joining us. And why don't you introduce yourself, your book, whatever you want to say to us.
Well, thank you, Conrad. It's a real privilege to be with you and the others who've joined us and or will be joining us. I really appreciate this opportunity. You mentioned the book, and I'm really bad at talking about things that I have produced or the Lord's helped me produce. And so I do want to mention it, though, because there's a particular purpose. This book was never intended to be a bestseller. The title of it is Spiritual Formation, Attention Along the Way. It's 70 stories of just noticing things around me that are speaking to me and into my life and have shaped me in my own formational process. And the reason I wrote it was that my hope and my prayer is that others will begin to notice what's around them and share that with others. For it has become my belief that in many ways, it isn't just that we have more information, particularly in this season, but that somehow we begin to connect both informationally, but also evocatively with that which is around us and allow the Spirit to speak to us through what's going on. And I think in many ways, this podcast has been a real attempt at doing that. And I so appreciate what you're doing, Conrad. So the book can be ordered Amazon. I just looked last night, they're sold out, but they're getting more. It was published by Westbow Press. They can be purchased there, but you can purchase it most reasonably and cheaply through openhandsministries.org. And we can offer it at a price the others don't or can't. I think one of the things I'd like to talk about is actually a quote from someone else, a person who's influenced my life at this point is Rich Volatus, who pastors a church in New York City. He followed Pete Scazzero, which is a name that a number of pastors might know. But in his book, The Deeply Formed Life, he says something that I think might be a good place for us to jump off from. He says, we yearn for meaningful union with God during our chaotic times. What lies beneath the surface of our lives might be how we find it. I think that speaks to some of the things that you're talking about in terms of dismantling, because over a year ago, of course, let's say even 18 months ago, as I worked with young pastors, there was a very different view in many ways of what they were headed into than there is today. There was a sense of there's certain things that we can count on. If you move in a community, you do certain things, you'll see results, you reach a certain number of people, and there was a lot of pressure to do that. Of course, we're always saying, the key is to be faithful to God, not necessarily focus on growth, but it really was about growth. There were a lot of corners that were being cut in terms of our own discipleship and deeply formed lives or not deeply formed lives. And we could get by with that in lots of ways in the culture we were in at that time. And I think that we in lots of ways, and myself included, have been discipled in superficiality as opposed to really going down deep within and focusing on some of that. A quote that I've used, and I noticed that others have used as well, but it's Richard Halverson, who happened to be the chaplain to the Senate for a number of years, and a number of years early in my own pastoral ministry. And he said, in the beginning, the church was a fellowship of men and women centered on a living Christ. Then the church moved to Greece, where it became a philosophy. Then it moved to Rome, where it became an institution. And next, it moved to Europe, where it became a culture. You remember the city-states and how they identified with certain religiosity. And finally, it moved to America, where it became an enterprise. I think in many ways, it is that enterprise that's being dismantled. That some of the things that pastors had counted on, congregations had counted on, if we do enough programming, if we do certain things within our community, we'll be known and people will respond, and of course they'll love the church. And the truth is that as a young staff pastor mentioned to me about a year ago, as we were meeting, he said, you know, I've seen how the sausage has been made, and now I'm not sure I would want to eat any of that sausage. And I'm just finding that over and over again, that Halverson was probably saying it better than he maybe even knew at that point. We truly did become an enterprise in many ways. And we've hit a spot where the things of that enterprise hasn't and isn't working anymore. There's a sense, so here's some of the things that I think we had before COVID, and here's some things that I think we're losing. And then we can talk about some of the ways maybe that God's at work, at least as I see and hear pastors and congregations. I think that before there was a certain kind of arrogant certainty. If I do these certain things, this will produce a church. And a living, vital, growing church, which I can go to meetings and talk about how big it has become, or even how faithful it is in the small community I may be in. But there's been this loss of control. Before, we felt pretty much in control, or for the most part, pastors, communities, and that was ripped apart through this COVID experience and then the other issues around that. I think that another is that it not only is the pandemic that impacted us, but in many ways, several facets of the pandemic politicized the church. Mm-hmm. And so for the first time, I think that in my recollection of the church, identifying yourself with one political party or the other identified you as either a good person or a hater. There wasn't much in between. And if you did something that one party might identify with more, for instance, the wearing of masks, then you certainly were demonized for that by some. On the others, you were applauded as a hero. You cared about other people. And so there was division over those kinds of things. Certainly there were racial issues. And I just recently heard of a pastor who held a town hall meeting. It was Rich Villodas in New York City. And in that town hall meeting, people found out that they'd been sitting beside each other, and some of them were Black Lives Matter folks, and others were Blue Lives Matter folks. And here they were sitting, but in the town hall meeting, it began to come out kind of where their position was. And there was a great deal of strife around that. And then, of course, one that I've really appreciated, I just saw it today, actually. There was some lady painting on a wall and it said "Old Lives Matter." And so I'm all about that nowadays with my age. But it is true that there's a division, and even in terms of immigrants and in terms of the Asian population with all of its variety of nationalities and ethnicities, we just realize that there is a lot of division around this, and it has become very politicized and creates a lot of strife within the church, which before it was there, but it seemed like it could be avoided. Now it no longer can be avoided. I think that's one of the big differences that pastors are feeling. It's like, okay, if I say one thing, it might be one way or another, I'm going to be identified as connecting there. Of course, we went through an election that was mild-mannered and very, very easy to deal with. And there's still people who think it isn't over. And so there's that tension as people begin to come back into buildings. I think another piece that I heard consistently and am still hearing from pastors is the whole social media issue, is that we now speak in sound bites. We can be really scathing around one simple phrase. It may be the whole thing is wonderful that is said, but that one phrase. And I talked to a pastor in tears the other day, just because of some of the social media feedback he got for something that was pretty innocuous in many ways, but that one phrase for some people held a political attachment that they couldn't get over and hear the message of really what he was sharing. And so when those people are back in the building, how is that going to go? And the other part is that pastors feel really pressured now to respond quickly. I meet with a bishop who looked back in some old files, and he said bishops before him, there would be a letter written and he would respond 3 weeks later. He said now if he gets an email or text at 10 o'clock at night and doesn't respond by 8 o'clock in the morning, people wonder what's wrong. Doesn't he care? And so pastors are finding themselves really responding on the run, which is really, really a dangerous place to be. At least I know for myself. If I'm on the spot all the time, I'm probably going to say something that later, as I think it through, I'd say I'd probably say that just a little bit differently. And there isn't much room for grace sometimes around the social media. The other thing is that and I've already mentioned this, but I think another piece is that whole hater issue, that if you don't agree with me, you hate me. And there's a woundedness around that a number of congregations are really, really struggling with, because they realize they have people on both sides of issues, and one group sees the other as haters. And really struggling with that whole message of love that Jesus talked about. And finally, I think there's two other things that I would wrap this up with. I think that before this pandemic, there was a sense of loneliness in the United States. Researchers had said this already, but it has become extreme, and not just loneliness, but isolation. And so we have these tragic stories of grandkids putting their hands up against the glass, maybe to a grandparent who they never see again. Those kinds of things. And pastors feel that. I think of one pastor who shared with me that she had had actually 5 people who had died just recently. And the funeral, there was no funerals that were held for any of them. There was a graveside service that involved just a small number of people, and that was it. So there's a sense of isolation. And then the last is that, of course, there's a lot of tragic stories that come from this time. And I don't think it's an overstatement. I know that some in our medical community are referring to this as a time of PTSD. But I think there really is some factors there that are leaving people with these kind of horrific, subconscious, even if you will, drives that are there that really speak of anxiety and fear, because it is a tragedy, and tragedies need to be and can be processed, but that's challenging. And particularly in some cases more than others. Well, it seems like I've talked a long time here now, and I would be glad to hear other questions. that might guide some of this conversation. But I do believe that we've experienced something unique, at least in my lifetime, in my 74 years. And it feels like it's raised a lot of questions now as we face, well, how do we rebuild? And maybe that's a place where we need to look a bit too, of how do we rebuild in the Spirit, if the Spirit indeed is renovating the church. What is that? What will that look like? And that may be something for us to talk about a bit too.
Eldon, you have painted a landscape that feels very familiar to me as a pastor over the last months. And one of the things that I have found myself struggling with is where are we in that landscape? And where were we before COVID? I thought I had a sense of that. Where are we now as we're kind of entering this new phase? And how far have we moved from the mission that God had for us? Because in some ways I sense among some of my congregation this sense of wanting to retrench, it feels like to me, to kind of, we've been through trauma, and so let's just heal ourselves, let's pull back. And yet the world around us has also experienced trauma. As pastors, we've experienced trauma. We've had some tough conversations, and now, as you mentioned, we're moving back into the same space. The one thing of the blessing of being distanced was we could be remote, and if we, you just turned off the Zoom at the end of the sermon, you don't do that anymore. You're meeting and greeting after the service. So, you're not one who has a quick answer. So what do you say to pastors in this landscape you've painted so well?
Well, thank you, Conrad. And I think that one of the things, and so obviously I don't have the answers for all of this, and I need to give credit to the Spirit. I think that if anything, the Spirit is calling us to an age of discernment instead of formulas. Mm-hmm. That instead of developing more formulas for the church, I think leadership is going to require discernment. And by that I mean that there's a sense of Spirit leadership that I think is really important. And perhaps, and in some ways, maybe it could be said this way, that those things that I may have made in shortcut, I may have cut some of my spiritual practices short, or they may have just become routine. I think we're going to need to discern where are those stress points now, and what are the kinds of things that I need to do to prepare and strengthen myself. Because after all, that's the Spirit behind the practices. Yes. Is that they are to prepare us. And so what is it? What are those points where I need to be prepared? Again, coming back to Rich Volatis, because he was zoomed into a retreat I was leading a couple of weeks ago. And I was impressed by one of the things he said, and I found myself repeating it and praying over it since then. He said that in this town hall meeting, he realized that he wasn't going to be able to be the bridge for all the divisions that were there. He tried to be careful that even people who after the town hall meeting decided to leave, knew that they had been heard. They might not be agreed with, but they had been heard, and felt like that was very important. But here was his goal, and I think it's a worthy goal for anyone in leadership at this point. He wanted to be a presence in this context, but he wanted to be a non-anxious presence. And the only way that I know to come to a non-anxious presence is to have that peace within that the scriptures talk about. Mm-hmm. Martin Laird wrote Into the Silent Land, and of course he was all about contemplation, but one of the things he noted was, and this was pre-COVID that he wrote this a number of years ago, he said that we can run from challenges, but those challenges will always have a grip on us in some way. Or we can turn and face those challenges and truthfully, like The Perfect Storm, if you know that movie, we could go down with the ship. It's still a real possibility that we won't make it through, but to do that with an inner peace that knows we are okay if the ship goes down, that there is this inner peace that will sustain us. And I think that's going to be more important in the lives of pastors and congregations than ever before, is that sense of peace that really comes out of this non-anxious presence that says, I can be with you in the storm. I know that God is with me and I will be with you. Years ago, I ran across a book called Love, Acceptance, and Forgiveness. And the key to that was not agreeing with everybody, but accepting where they were, accepting their stories. And we all know that a lot of healing from tragedy comes by being able to tell the story. And that's where we can comfort each other. We can really have a role in that spiritual healing, I believe, by respecting people and listening to their story, even if it's a story that we don't really resonate with, or maybe even fully agree that this is the way I saw it happening, but are that non-anxious presence that allows people to feel respected as they share that. I think that's a really important piece moving forward.
Now, part of the challenge of that, Eldon, is that from some of those folks, we heard some pretty harsh things over the last year.
Yes.
And so to sit down with them, things that were in fact traumatizing.
Yeah.
And so how do you, so I'm listening to you and I agree with you, but I'm also thinking about my capacity as a pastor to absorb only so many conversations.
Yeah.
That may or may not be friendly conversations, because I may be postured towards listening, but they may not be. So how do we also set boundaries that are appropriate boundaries that we need to do in order to protect ourselves, or we end up, you hear what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think in fact, I had that conversation today with a pastor and worship leader. And, I think that there is this place that it's really important for us to know who we are, and to know then that this what issues are mine, what issues might be that other person's. And that's a place to set a boundary, to be able to be free to say, I know who I am enough that just because you're saying things that are really hurtful or have said them, that I still am comfortable knowing who I am in God. I heard an illustration of this that has nothing to do with the church, but I think it has everything to do with it. I met with a person who's a church leader today, but he's also a baseball umpire. And he's a top level baseball umpire. And in one of the games more recently that he was umpiring, there was somebody behind the backstop who was yelling at him the entire time, telling him he should go home, not take his paycheck, telling him that, you've called that strikes all day long, and just being obnoxious. And this person, for some reason, it really got to him, because typically it doesn't, but this time it really did. And as we sat with that and talked it through, one of the things that had happened was that he lost sight of the fact that he is like the number one umpire. And the others around him are saying, you're actually doing a really good job. So do I listen to the voice that has never taken the time to learn to be an umpire? Or do I listen to those voices that say, this is who you are, and we recognize that? I think there's a part of pastoring moving ahead that's going to be, we're going to have to be careful not just simply to be people pleasers, We're going to have to be comfortable. This is who God has made me. And I'm
Eldon,
okay.
I think that's a really powerful statement that you made about being comfortable with the fact that we have been called to be the umpire, or whatever it is that we've been called to be, and we've been trained, and
Yeah.
we've been discerned. And but I think one of the things that you've been so helpful to me is that I only get there if I'm spending time with God, if I've developed my life with God, because God tells me who I am.
Yeah.
And I don't need that message every week. I need that message every moment of every day.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that you have helped me with, and one of the language that you use, which I often repeat in the congregation, is, can you sit with this for a while? Can you sit with that question with God? Can you tell us in practical terms, when we talk about a life with God, we talk about the disciplines, but they can seem so theoretical and abstract. Can you give us as pastors some guidance as to what it means to sit with these questions? What it means to sit with God? What's this look like? What's your counsel for us? And because that connection with God and our identity in Him couldn't be more important than it is right now.
Yeah, when we sit with things, I think the whole key is in some ways it brings up the word, which I know is not a biblical word, but reflection. I need to reflect on these experiences. I need to reflect on the questions it raises. I need to reflect on, as this umpire did, why did that bother me today? And it hasn't bothered me for 15 or 20 years. I think that's what I'm talking about, is sitting back and in lots of ways asking the question, what is it that God may be saying to me through this? Mm-hmm. What is it that I may need? And Paul was clear, there's some things we need to hold on to, some things we need to let go of. So what are the things I need to hold on to, and what are some of the things I need to let go of? And I think that's an important discipline right now, as we rejoin. I read something recently, and it's from Find Your Shine Therapy. So it's a therapy person, but it's speaking to pastors. And here's what it said. And this isn't answering your question exactly, but I think it speaks to some of our own vulnerability in this process, that it isn't like we just have this down pat. He says, you are resilient and you need a break. And that's been hard for some people. They felt like they had to be on top of it all the time, had to have all the answers. You gave your all, and you still need to back out. And they're telling us now somewhere between 20 and 40% of pastors may actually say, I've had enough. You are independent and still need others. And I think if there's one consistent message I'm giving to pastors right now, is to make sure you have a network where you are sharing and you are growing. I think that is so important right now because of this isolation part of the experience. And another, you were sure, and things have changed, so we're not sure anymore. Can we actually say, I don't know, and be okay? There's some research out there that says children as young as 7 years old don't want to answer, I don't know. They'll make up an answer. And I think as adults, I find myself I don't want to be the person who doesn't know. And yet I need to be able to say that in this kind of context. Others have it worse, and your own pain is valid. You did your best, and this is a result of sitting with it. And now you know more than you did before. I think that when I talk about sitting with it, is that ability. Disciples means learners. And I think that in the process of feeling like we had to be the answers to all things wonderful and a more corporate model, we stop being learners and we are makers. And I think it's important for us again to embrace, I'm still learning.
Eldon, I shared with our congregation on Sunday, the title of my message was, Can We Talk Ourselves to Sleep? And it came out of an experience that Heidi and I had with our grandson Ezra the week before, where we were watching him while Jacob and Sarah went away, and he was grand. He was having a blast eating his dinner, and he was just a ham, and it was terrific. But then it came time for a nap, and his lips started to quiver, and he started to pucker up like he was going to cry. But he kept saying to himself, "Mama, mama, mama, dada, nap. Mama, dada, nap. Mama, dada, nap." And he did this for a few minutes, and then he lay down and went to sleep. But Heidi said afterwards, it was remarkable. He talked himself out of his anxiety by remembering what mom and dada had said. And so when Sarah came home, she said, "Oh, we told him, Mom and Daddy will come home after your nap." And so I wonder if it's not also, as we are doing this as pastors, being this non-anxious presence, by spending time developing, nurturing, deepening our life with God in this moment, if it's not also an opportunity to help our congregations to learn to depend on God too, and not on us, by just acknowledging our brokenness, that we don't have the answers, we're not sure where we're going, but we need to, each of us, say, "Mama, Dad, a nap." And you know, and that for me came out of Psalm 131, that unweaned, you know, as a child is being weaned from its mother and remembers the promises. So I wonder about this as an opportunity to pass this also on to our congregations.
I love that story, and I think it models something that I believe in very, very much. And you realize that even in very early Christianity, there's records of people coming to that kind of point. Because remember, I guess this is one of the things that, you know, if misery loves company, I think of the early church. My goodness, they didn't know what church was to begin with. And then secondly, they've got this person who's out to kill everybody who identifies with this, and they're on the move, and all these kind of things are happening. And somehow out of that chaos, you know, came what we look back and say it changed the world. And it would seem like we're selling ourselves short if we would say, well, I just got to live anxiously in all this. It seems like there is that point of memory. And I read something, I think it was yesterday, but it was one of these days very recently. It's by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I always stumble over that, but it was just wonderful. And he lays a background of this memory thing. And then he says, if a man has only one good memory left in his heart, even that may keep him from evil. And if he carries many such memories with him into life, he is safe for the end of his days. Now, he used that in male. I believe that's true for male or female, that those memories are really helpful. And I've encouraged pastors to do something that I have that's not the magic pill, but it's made a difference in my life. So I'm in my 16th week of the practice of joy. And it really comes out of an author and counselor and pastor who discovered that when they identified, or clients identified, a memory of joy and would sit with that for 5 to 10 minutes, it changed them dramatically. And so my practice of joy is just remembering back in my early childhood. We didn't have running water in our house, and so you took a bath in the middle of the kitchen in one of those tubs that they sell at antique stores now. And of course, as I went into middle school and high school, I wasn't excited about that. So my grandparents, who lived not all that far away, had running water, and they put a shower in their house. So I would go down on Saturday nights. My grandmother always baked bread on Saturdays. She would cut the end of the loaf off of this hot bread, and I loved the heel, so she would cut the heel off of this loaf of bread, put homemade butter on it, and welcome me into their house. And my grandfather also did that. In fact, actually, he put gas in my car at times, which was really important because it was I don't know, probably 30 miles to my girlfriend's home. So to drive there was took a lot of gas back in those days. And yet they knew that I wasn't living fully a Christian life, but they loved me anyway. And so in the mornings when I awaken, I start off with a simple prayer that says, "Thank you, God, for the gift of today. Help me to use it to the glorification of your name." And then the second thing is I go to my place, my memory of joy. And I've discovered that doesn't make for a perfect day, but it changes my attitude to realize God was at work at this kid's life who was rejecting everything that he was hearing about this God who blamed and was angry and upset. And so I thought, well, if that's the only God there is out there, I can't follow God. But I saw something different in my grandparents.
Well, it reminds me of where we started. Half an hour ago, you talked about that we depended upon information, but now we need something that's more evocative, something that comes from within, something that's visceral, something that we experience joy. We experience the memory of what, and so I'm struck by that. Because it won't be more information that gets us through this. Probably.
Here's a prayer for the church that I'm offering. Years ago, the person who probably touched my life in a significant way was Francis Schaeffer, who wrote a book, The Church at the End of the 20th Century, and really focused on the need for love relationships within the life of the church, and that would make a difference when all these other extra things weren't going to make a difference. I don't know that he saw COVID, but that's the way he was writing back in those days. But he talks about the brethren in Germany and divided over some who had followed Hitler or at least acquiesced to Hitler and had experienced very little pain, and those who had resisted and had family members who were killed, etc. And they met as a group after the war was over. And the story went this way, that they were challenged to go out and to pray and to imagine themselves at the foot of the cross. And they came back together for the sacrament of communion. And the story goes that at that point, they were just one. They were able to lay aside all that seemed so important and hurtful before. That's my prayer for the church today, that somehow there can be that love illustrated, shared, and not ignoring all the pain, but being able to say the pain for sure, but also embracing each other in love and care. And moving forward rather than moving backwards. I think that's what the Spirit would be saying to the church today, for us to come together, to heal, and to walk in unity that hasn't been in existence for well over a year now.
So we're getting close to wrapping up, Eldon, but what's the pathway there?
Yes. Well, I think as pastors, so I'll speak to pastors first. I think the pathway there is for pastors to model something different than the frenetic life they were living before. I think that our preaching needs to be different, in the sense that there needs to be a renewed focus on love. And there's a good Hebrew word, and I don't know Hebrew, but I have a book that's 42 Hebrew words that everyone should know. And so one of those words is Hesed. It looks like Hesed, but it's chesed. And it speaks of attachment, but attachment, if I'm attached to someone, I sense their love, and there's a joy when I look into their face. And I think that that's something that pastors need to lead into. more than all the programs, more than all the wonderful things of trying to keep up with everything that's out there. I think that's where it begins. Now there's decisions after that, so I don't minimize that. You have to decide, how are we going to be Christ in our communities, those kinds of things for sure. But I think it starts with that place of chesed, that we become attached to each other truly with love and joy, and that sense of peace. I think that's where it begins. And pastors have opportunity to lead into it, and there's not a lot written about how pastors do that. It's more of how to grow your church, all those other kinds of things, which are all good and wonderful. I'm not saying they're bad. It just isn't enough for the age we're in.
They were good for a church industrial complex, but when that complex has been blown up, I'm struck by how much of what you said overlaps with. I interviewed Richard Kaufman last week, who has been editor both for Christianity Today and also for Christian Century, and he said, he's struck by how little how little the language of love and the Spirit are in the church today.
Absolutely.
But then also as well, prayer and testimony. And I hear you today, those 4 words, prayer, testimony, love, the Spirit. I hear you addressing all of those.
I think it's really important. Thank you for connecting that with his, because a lot of things he said was really profound, but I think it really is key for the age we're living in. And this is a little story in my own life. Started pastoring this little church in a university town. Had 36 people, so we were growing. We were going places. I actually asked the service station attendant down the road, just at the end of the block, where the church was. He had no idea where it was. So I would tell you that we were making a big difference in that community. But after 3 years of preaching on love, my wife finally said, "Eldon, are you ever going to preach about anything else?" And I said to her, "No, not until we get this right. Because if we don't get this right, all the other things we do won't make the difference we've been praying for here."
Wow.
And yeah, it was a different situation, different culture, different times. I get all of that. But God blessed with some incredible miracles and healing and changes in the community too. We actually had to change our name to Community Church because we really were a community church. And we did a lot of things wrong. We made a lot of mistakes. We failed, but that was one of our rights, and we still would love each other. We were committed to that. I think Jesus knew what he was speaking about when he said the first commandment, the great commandment, is to love the Lord your God. But he didn't take a deep breath and think a long time before he added the second. And the second one is like to love your neighbor as yourself. I just think they're connected and they're foundational, like maybe never before in our history.
Eldon, thank you. Thank you for what you brought to us today. It's why I love sitting with you. You bring, just this wealth, not just of information, but this evocation or this evocative part that my spirit responds to. And so thank you for what you brought to all of us today. To the audience, I just want to say Eldon will be a guest tomorrow at Camp Hebron for Lancaster Mennonite Conference's Leadership Assembly. But we are opening that up remotely by Zoom to anyone who wants to Zoom in to hear Eldon. And so if you're not part of LMC and you want to hear Eldon speak tomorrow, you can go to the LMC Church's website and click on the Zoom link, and Eldon will be sharing. There'll be a number of activities throughout the day, but there are a couple of places where Eldon is sharing tomorrow. And so we want to invite you to be part of that if you'd like to be. Eldon, thank you. Any last words you want to offer us?
Well, what a privilege this is. And I think these are, I would say there's two pieces. One, we've been in a season of lamenting. And I think if we haven't lamented, we should.
Yeah.
But then at the end of the lament, over and over again, was this place of hope and joy.
Mm-hmm.
And I just encourage us to pray for that, look for that, and discern what that might look like in 2021, for sure.
That's a great word to end on, Eldon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, to those of you who are guests with us, you can find this in a few moments. It will be on my YouTube channel, Conrad Carnegie, which you will find all of the other guests there as well that we've had over the last 4 or 5 weeks. And it will also be loaded as an audio podcast on A Church Dismantled, A Kingdom Restored, which will be a live at 3:45 podcast episode there. Thank you, Eldon. God's
Thank
blessing
you.
to you, brother. To all of you, thank you for joining us today. Peace.